In this section, I want to take a closer look at an important gene found on the short arm of the Y chromosome. In fact, I believe this is the most important gene I will discuss in this entire presentation. What I'm referring to here is the SRY gene, which stands for the sex-determining region on the Y. Personally, I find it helpful to think of this gene as a giant lever that sets off male development. When the SRY gene is expressed, that lever is effectively pulled and male development proceeds. I like the way the geneticist Kat Arney describes the importance of the SRY gene in early embryonic development. She puts it this way: until around the 6th week of pregnancy, there is no detectable difference between human male XY or female XX embryos growing in the womb. Now that's really interesting. Keep that in mind. Let's get back to the rest of the quote. The critical moment in making a male occurs when a gene on the Y chromosome called SRY is switched on. SRY encodes a transcription factor that switches on a cascade of genes that make some important changes. Now at this point, I want to show you a basic diagram which I find helpful to conceptualize two different developmental pathways. So here we see a roadway which has a shared roadway initially, but then it diverges into two pathways. The pathway on the left represents female development and the pathway on the right represents male development. Or another way to think of these pathways is that they represent the process of sexual differentiation, whereby genes and hormones work together to bring about either female or male development. And so as we've seen with male development and the SRY gene, we have this first 6 weeks of development, then the SRY gene is expressed and that lever is effectively pulled, and then lots of other genes are expressed and a baby boy will go down a male developmental pathway. Now, the importance of the SRY gene cannot be overstated because that gene sets off all sorts of other genes. To bring even further clarity to the importance of what SRY does, I want to quote the Genetic Society podcast. And this quote that I show you, it is kind of quirky, but you will get the idea of the significance of what SRY does. They describe it this way: the SRY gene makes a protein that activates a whole bunch of male-specific transcription factors, which basically run around the rest of the genome shouting things like, turn those non-specific gonads into testes, ramp up testosterone production, get rid of that Mullerian duct so we don't grow a uterus. Now, of course, we don't have male transcription factors running around the genome shouting things, but you get the point. SRY sets off a whole cascade of changes, and you can see why I think likening the SRY gene to a giant lever is an apt analogy. Okay, well, let's go back to our pathway diagram and let's consider this first 6 weeks of shared development. And as we think of this 6 weeks of development, it can actually help us ponder an intriguing but kind of a quirky question that sometimes comes up in biology. And that question is this: why do males have nipples? Well, when we understand that both male and female embryos initially have this shared pathway of development, that actually goes a long way to understanding why males have nipples. But more seriously, it's important to realize in these early weeks of embryonic development, a baby grows both Mullerian ducts, which give rise to female reproductive structures, and Wolffian ducts, which give rise to male reproductive structures. Initially, a baby grows both of these. However, remember how that quote I just read to you from the Genetic Society, when describing male development, it said, get rid of the Mullerian duct so we don't grow a uterus. And that is a standard part of male early embryonic development. It involves getting rid of the Mullerian duct. Alternatively, standard female embryonic development involves getting rid of the Wolffian duct early on so they don't grow male reproductive structures. Nevertheless, some people might wonder, well, if a baby initially has both of these structures, what does that mean? Does that mean the baby is both male and female, or does it mean they are neither? Well, I think the answer to this question lies in realizing that we are looking at the very early stages of a developmental process. The analogy I like to use is this one. Imagine that you had two buildings being constructed side by side. Now, these buildings were going to be quite distinct from each other. One of them might be an apartment block and the other one might be a convenience store like 7-Eleven. And even though when they're constructed, they're obviously going to look very different from each other, in the very early stages of construction, they might be barely distinguishable from each other. They might both look like just a concrete slab with a few bits of plumbing sticking out of the slab. However, as the construction proceeds, these buildings will look more and more distinct from each other. In the same way as embryonic development proceeds, male and female babies are obviously going to look more and more distinct from each other. And it's important to also realize, if we go back to the construction analogy, it's not like the builders are confused. They're not turning up to the construction site every morning with their morning coffee going, hang on a second, which one's the apartment block and which one's the convenience store? And the reason they are not confused is that they have the construction plan right in front of them and they know how things are going to proceed. In the same way, even though physically you might not be able to distinguish between male and female babies in the early stages of development, physically, the genetic instructions are there from the point of conception. We know that the sex chromosomes are there from the point of conception, and that gives us a very, very good indication which developmental pathway this baby is most likely to go down. Okay, so we've considered the male developmental pathway. Let's now have a closer look at the female developmental pathway. And when we consider the female developmental pathway, sometimes it's referred to as the default pathway or the default condition. Alternatively, sometimes you might hear, in regard to female development, you'll hear things like, in the absence of SRY, female development proceeds. Now, admittedly, that's a pretty strange way to describe it, but basically what it means is if the SRY isn't present, the SRY gene isn't present, or if there's some problem with it being activated, there's going to be this tendency to veer towards female development. Now, admittedly, that description, default pathway, I'm the first to admit that is not a very flattering way to describe female development. I mean, when my friends had a baby girl, and if I wrote them a card that said, congratulations on the arrival of your default pathway child, I don't think that's going to go down very well. In fact, I'm never going to get a job at Hallmark if I write cards like that. And that's why I also want to quote, I like the quote from the Genetic Society podcast where they describe female development and bring some clarity to this situation. They put it this way. Without the SRY gene barking orders to become male, the embryo develops as female, although this is far from the passive act that the all embryos are default female line would have you believe. Becoming female is just as active and complicated a process as becoming male, as the embryo starts ramping up female transcription factors, getting rid of the Wolffian duct and turning the gonads into ovaries. So you see, the Genetic Society podcast correctly points out that becoming female is just as active and complicated a process as becoming male and involves all these female-specific changes. Okay, well, we've considered that key gene in early male development, the SRY gene. What about some key genes in early female development? Well, listed beside me here are two examples of really important genes in early female development. There are certainly others, but these are certainly two important ones. And notice also I have listed the chromosomes that they reside on. Both of them are found on chromosome number 1. An autosome. And this just reinforces the point that a lot of the genes that are involved in male and female sexual development aren't just confined to our sex chromosomes, they are found on our autosomes. In fact, the genes controlling male and female development are spread across our entire genome. Now, before I wrap things up here, one other important point I wanted to make is that some of the genes that promote male or female development seem to be mutually antagonistic towards each other. What I mean by that is some of the genes that promote male development seem to suppress female development, and some of the genes that promote female development seem to suppress male development. So as an example, when that key gene on the Y chromosome involved in male development, SRY, is expressed, that upregulates other genes, and these genes play a role in suppressing the gene WNT4, this key gene in female development. Alternatively, however, if the SRY gene isn't expressed, this same gene, WNT4, actually plays a role in suppressing some of the genes involved in male development. So we see there's mutually antagonistic genes. Some of the genes that promote female development suppress male development, and some of the genes that promote male development suppress female development. So in this section, we have seen some of the important changes that occur during early in utero development. But in the next section, I want to take a closer look at the important question, what about hormones?